Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 15th of March here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Emmanuel Macron warns of an existential threat from Russia unless Putin's forces are defeated in Ukraine.
Fresh data leaves the Fed with even more reasons to go slow on interest rate cuts.
And maybe not. Rishi Sunak rules out the possibility of a UK general election in 6 weeks' time.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
France's President Emmanuel Macron says the EU faces an existential threat unless Russian forces are defeated in Ukraine. Macron has sought to take a lead on European support for Kyiv, organising a summit at which countries agreed to source ammunition from outside the EU. Speaking to French television ahead of a meeting with Poland and Germany's leaders in Berlin today, the French president made his position clear.
We have suffered the consequences in Europe. The price of gas, the economic situation, the price of grain, the economic disruptions that followed are the consequences of this war that Russia has started. If Russia wins this war, the credibility of Europe will be reduced to zero. What would be the credibility in our country of an EU whose members allowed that to happen?
Emmanuel Macron's comments come as voters head to the polls in Russia for a presidential election. Vladimir Putin is all but guaranteed to win. The near certainty of another 6-year term in the Kremlin for Putin comes as Russian forces appear to be gaining the advantage in Ukraine. Meanwhile, a major $60 billion US military aid package remains in political limbo, ensnared in rows over domestic immigration issues.
Now, the European Central Bank has achieved a soft landing, according to the Governing Council member Yannis Stournaras. He told an event in London that monetary policy has been successful despite all the criticism. Meanwhile, the ECB Vice President Luis de Guindos, in separate comments in Barcelona, reiterated that inflation is returning to the 2% target, though wage pressures still pose risks. ECB officials have ramped up the debate about how soon they may slash interest rates, with Stournaras telling Bloomberg at least 2 cuts are needed before the August summer break.
New data is giving the Federal Reserve even more reason to delay interest rate cuts. Producer prices increased 0.6% from January, signalling persistent inflation. Unemployment data showed fewer people applied for and received jobless benefits than thought. The findings are likely to overshadow cooling consumer spending at the start of 2024. Willem Sells, Chief Investment Officer at HSBC Global Private Banking and Wealth, says the equity market remains resilient despite the news.
And then the inflation data, I'm not too worried about that because it's very much at a margin that it is, above expectations. And what you see is that the margins of corporates are still going up. So the equity market is actually taking it more in its stride than the bond market is, right? Mm-hmm. With a big bond market move, the equity market only moving relatively small in the US last night, because those earnings are there.
HSBC's Willem Sells was speaking ahead of next week's Fed meeting where officials are expected to leave rates unchanged.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has ruled out a UK general election on the 2nd of May. Here he is speaking to ITV News.
We've got elections for police and crime commissioners, for local councils, for mayors across the country. They're important elections.
And not a general election.
That's what I'm focused on. There won't be a general election on that day. Yeah. But when there is a general election, what matters is the choice.
The Prime Minister also told ITV that it was his working assumption that it would take place in the second half of the year. There had been speculation that Sunak would call a national ballot for the spring. A general election does need to be called, though, before the end of January next year.
New data on the Chinese economy due out next week is expected to show a mixed start to the year. Economists surveyed by Bloomberg see retail sales and industrial output slowing in January compared to December. Property development investment is expected to have plunged as the sector fails to mount a meaningful turnaround. The numbers to be published on Monday are broadly expected to show the Chinese economy was relatively stable in the fourth quarter.
One Deutsche Bank employee raked in more than 14 million euros last year, making them the lender's top earner in almost a decade. The second highest paid banker received just under 10 million euros, according to the bank's annual report, which was released on the same day that Bloomberg reported a cut in its overall bonus pool. The top salary is at its highest since at least 2014, which is when the German lender began reporting its earners under new disclosure agreements.
And back here to the UK, where the next election will see the government judged on its pledges. MPs have found plans to level up disadvantaged UK regions are far behind schedule, with only 1 in 5 set to finish their deadline next month. Tua Adebayo has the story.
More than £10 billion was set aside to level up Britain, a core pledge of the Johnson government.
We are going to unite and level up. Unite and level up, bringing together the whole of this incredible United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, together, taking us forward, unleashing the potential of the whole country.
Yet, 5 years on, the Public Accounts Committee says only 10% of that money has been spent. Projects in the first round of funding should be completed by a deadline next month. 4 in 5 say they'll miss that date. The committee says the government are unable to provide compelling evidence of what levelling up has achieved. In London, Tua Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
And those are our top stories this morning. On the markets, the MSCI Asia Pacific Index is currently down 1%. Looking to the European market open, US Stocks 50 futures are flat and 10-year US Treasury yields down about a basis point, but now trading at 4.28% after the PPI data yesterday.
Now, in a moment, we'll get more on Emmanuel Macron's blunt warnings about the threat from Putin and Russia in Ukraine. Plus, we'll be looking more in detail at those comments from the British Prime Minister about the possibility of when the next election will be held. But first, though, another story that caught our eye about an expensive sandwich.
Look, it's Friday. I thought perhaps we would insert this because it's bound to turn up in your Instagram feed if you're, food mad. This new wildly expensive Wagyu beef sandwich. Apparently it's going to be arriving in November. This is chef Kentaro Nakahara, who invented the Wagyu sandwich. Didn't know that 20 years ago. Now he's got a new version of it. It's all going to be served up in a new restaurant that opens up in November in Miami's design district. So apparently it's motivation for me to get over to the US. Perhaps.
Oh yeah, definitely. I would want you to report back and tell me whether or not it's worth the trip.
Well, and also worth the cost of paying for this sandwich, because apparently this delightful little morsel is only available part of a 10-course meal, an omakase, it's all the kind of grilled meats that you get, $350 apparently for that 10-course dinner, I suppose,
right.
Lunch maybe.
Good, yeah, looking forward to hearing more about that, and you can read more about that. Our colleagues from Bloomberg Pursuits have been writing about that, and you can read more on the terminal and on Bloomberg.com. Well, now France's president says Europe faces an existential threat if Russia wins its war in Ukraine. This as voting gets underway in today's presidential election in Russia. We've got Bloomberg's Tony Halpin with us for more on this story this morning. Tony, great to have you on. Emmanuel Macron says that Russia's war in Ukraine is existential, not only for France, but for the EU as a whole. Is a Russian invasion or a Russian escalation a threat to other European countries?
Good morning. Yes, certainly many NATO and EU members in Eastern Europe believe that that's the case, and that Putin, if he's successful in Ukraine, will not stop there and will threaten their territorial integrity. That presents, of course, a huge challenge to them in defense terms, as President Macron alluded to, that many in Europe simply haven't woken up to the fact that war has returned to the continent.
Yes, there's no doubt particularly about the outcome of the Russian election. But how has Vladimir Putin portrayed himself in the run-up to the vote? Because that's quite important in understanding, his mentality right now.
Yes, very much so. And he has presented himself in that way as Russia's strong national leader, with the country fully united behind him as he challenges the West and seeks to prosecute his war in Ukraine, or what Russia continues to refer to as a special military operation. He's determined to win in Ukraine. He thinks he sees a divided West that will allow him to win in Ukraine, and that may very well feed into his ambitions.
Tony, we're also, of course, conscious that this could be a very important moment for Russia going forward as well. How could it affect the military campaign in Ukraine?
Yes, the vote's taking place actually just as Russia's beginning to make some advances in Ukraine for the first time in months. And that's partly the result of the fact that Ukraine is lacking ammunitions because it's been waiting for European and US military assistance to come, and that assistance is still held up in the US, for example. So Russia is taking advantage of that by applying ever greater force and trying to make some progress. Ukraine claims that it's halted that advance, but I think the election will just encourage Russia to continue to press and seek to make ever more gains.
Also, Putin is chairing the BRICS group this year. What influence is that giving him ahead of a summit that takes place later?
Yes, that's very important to Russia, actually, because the US and Europe have sought to bring Russia's economy to its knees with overwhelming international sanctions, and Russia has managed to evade some of the impact of that by appealing to the global south and to Asia and China in particular. And China, India, Brazil are all big powers. They're all members of the BRICS group. All of the leaders of those countries are expected to attend a summit with Putin in Russia later this year. So it's a great opportunity for Putin to continue to try to weaken the impact of economic sanctions and to strengthen his political case that he is standing up against the West and that it deserves their support.
OK, Tony Halpin, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on that story.
Now let's turn our attention to the UK. The Prime Minister has ruled out holding a general election in May on the same day as voters already going to the polls for local and mayoral elections. This despite the pressure on Rishi Sunak over controversial comments made by a prominent donor to his Conservative Party. Our UK politics reporter James Alcock joins us now for more on this. Do you think that May was really a possibility for a general election? He now does seem to have completely ruled it out.
Well, yes, there is a world in which it would have happened. You can imagine a big polling boost on the budget, maybe. Divisive headlines around Gaza causing the Labour Party to fragment. A rallying around the leader. Some sort of big poll bump. And for what it's worth, Caroline, he didn't rule out an election in May. He ruled an election on May 2nd specifically. It is in Rishi Sunak's power to call an election at any point on any day he so chooses. And if he wanted to, he could go after what are presumed to be disastrous local election results on May 2nd with a general election a few weeks after. It is very unlikely, but it is not impossible. You kind of get into the arithmetic then of like, well, if not May, 2nd, would you really do it a week after? Then you sort of bump your say all the way down to sort of summer holidays in June, July period. So it is now the working assumption it's in the second half of the year. But for what it's worth, like, you shouldn't second guess a Prime Minister who is on the ropes. Like,
so when is an election looking more likely then, James?
It was all down to Rishi Sunak. And I think one of the reasons that May became this strange lightning rod for criticism, given in January, he said it was his working assumption that the election would be in the second half of the year. So that's about as clear as a politician who's not going to give away his goods is going to get. So why was there the speculation in the first place for May? Broadly, it came down to the reporting that Bloomberg and other news organisations did that said cabinet ministers and Rishi Sunak's own top team were doubting the government would hold together that long. And so, Stephen, when you're trying to gauge where the Rishi Sunak will call this election, the two metrics you have to look at, it seems, are the first one, the ordinary Prime Minister one, which is when does he think his chances of winning are greatest? And the reason why the May speculation came in is the second one, which is, does he and his top team, the people who keep him in power, think there is a risk of mass deterioration in the quality of government that would be worse than holding on till November? And so the reason why May became such a hot button date was because the second group, the second of sort of the dissenters, the fearful of sort of disaster group, were increasingly worried. And so that was why we had reached this furor last night where Rishi Sunak had to go on to ITV West Country and say there is no election in May. And so in terms of where it's likely, I think November is still where a lot of the smart money is in terms of that is a natural point to have an election. That is a point where sort of lots of the Conservatives' stars aligns. And it is a place where it's not winter, it's summer holidays. But I think But again, it's only Rishi Sunak who can tell you, and it is in his gift.
Well, and also the thinking is people are away in the summer holidays, and if you come back, you can have Parliament not sit in September. You can call a general election. It would happen 6 weeks later in November, and then you'd also bypass all of the political campaign, the political parties that usually meet in October as well, because you'd be in election mode. Look, the question is, does that give the Conservatives, does giving the Conservatives more time allow them to close the polling gap with Labour, or does it allow more time for more controversies, as we have been discussing all week?
Well, one of the arguments for some of the cabinet ministers that Bloomberg were hearing from for going for the May election in the first place would have been it was the last time Rishi Sunak really had control over the timeline. He could have moved before Labour were ready. He could have, sort of been able to sort of say, we're doing it now. The problem is the later you get into the summer, the more time Labour have to plan, because there is only a few months left in that sort of calendar. So they will know it's November, December, January. By September, we will know the date by one way or the other, really, because if it hasn't been announced yet, it will be December, January. So that side of the control is there as well for Sunak. The other precedent here is Gordon Brown, who famously got into talks about calling an election, then pulled away at the last moment. And although it's Rishi Sunak's sole choice, it's not a consequence-free choice. And already Labour are running ads about him being a chicken, and the idea that he's being so cagey about this date, it's a sign of weakness.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.